Good morning, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Creating a Skilled Workforce, a Guide to the Saskatchewan Job Grant, hosted in partnership with the Saskatchewan Job Grant team. My name is Michaela Stanger. I'm a Career and Professional Development Program Coordinator here at the Center for Continuing Education, and I'll be introducing our speakers for today's session. First, I would like to acknowledge and recognize that the beautiful and historic University of Regina College Avenue campus, where we're broadcasting from today, is situated on Treaty 4 lands. This is the territory of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis-Michif Nation. Today, these lands continue to be the shared territory of many diverse peoples from near and far. We're so glad you joined us today to learn more about this wonderful funding opportunity. The Saskatchewan Job Grant supports local employers by providing funding to train, develop, and retrain a skilled workforce. Funding ensures that employees are equipped with the necessary skills to be able to be successful in new jobs or to be promoted to better jobs. We're joined today by Jeff Bazendowski and his team from the Saskatchewan Job Grant Program. They'll be providing valuable information about the goals of the program, eligibility criteria, funding amounts, and the application process. The presentation will be followed by a question and answer period. So if you have any questions for Jeff or his team throughout the presentation, please either raise your hand so they can be answered or put them in the chat area to be answered at the end. And with that, I'll hand it over to Jeff so he can get started. Thank you for joining us today.
Awesome. Thank you, Michaela, and thank you, Emma, for providing an opportunity to talk through our program about the Saskatchewan Job Grant. As Michaela had mentioned, my name is Jeff Bazendowski, and I'm with the Saskatchewan Job Grant team. And joining me as well from the team is Amanda Lavoie, Amanda O'Brien, and Derek Wagner as well. So we're very happy to be discussing our program today. And as Michaela had mentioned, we want this to be an interactive session. We want you to ask lots of questions. So if you have questions throughout the presentation, I'll periodically pause to address raised hands. You put them in the chat. We also want to make sure that you're comfortable using the chat. So if you wouldn't mind, maybe pop into the chat who you are, what organization you represent, and maybe where you're joining us from today, because as we understand, there's probably some people joining us from not just Regina, but across the province as well. So diving into the Saskatchewan Job Grant, just a quick little summary as well. We've recently gone through a name and a branding change. So you'll see some of our website materials that we're working on updating reference the Canada Saskatchewan Job Grant. This is a recent change that we're working through, but now it is officially known as the Saskatchewan Job Grant. So just to eliminate any confusion, it's the same program, just going through kind of a rebranding exercise right now. So to set a little context, as far as the Saskatchewan labor market, we really wanted to touch on the Saskatchewan labor market strategy overall. Now, the Saskatchewan labor market strategy was released in early 2024, and it was done in conjunction with a variety of partners and stakeholders and post-secondary institutions, employers and different ministries across the government of Saskatchewan to really match up the labor market requirements to the significant growth that's taking place within the province of Saskatchewan right now. This ties in nicely with the Saskatchewan Plan for Growth 2030, which targets 1.4 million population in the province for Saskatchewan by 2030, and 100,000 new jobs or 100,000 more people working in Saskatchewan by 2030 as well. When we look at the investment in Saskatchewan, we've seen significant growth over the last number of years. Our gross domestic product has increased in the last couple of years by about 5.7%. And our resource exports have also increased to approximately $52 billion per year. So there are some significant resource assets and significant growth going on in the province that does require people. In addition to this, private interests and private companies have invested around $13 billion over the last year into Saskatchewan, and that's leading the nation as far as our provincial growth. So industries, businesses are seeing the potential in Saskatchewan, they're seeing the growth in Saskatchewan. But with all this opportunity and all of the resources and all the significant growth that we're experiencing, we also need the people to support that growth, or else we won't be able to take advantage of it. And that's where the Saskatchewan labor market strategy comes in. So essentially, we have three pillars in that Saskatchewan labor market strategy. And if you're interested, you can always kind of reference and look it up and go back to it. But essentially, there's three major pillars. The first being preparing Saskatchewan people for jobs. There's a number of different components under this pillar, including Indigenous engagement in the workforce. Now, we have a young and extremely fast-growing population that is sometimes underutilized in the workforce. And getting these individuals engaged, whether that's in the north, in the resource sector, across the province, it's an accessible talent pool that we want to continue to upskill and get into the workforce and help see those advantages of the growth. Similarly, persons with disabilities within Saskatchewan. It is typically an underutilized labor pool, and by creating inclusive environments and inclusive employers, we're able to better engage those individuals long term, attract them to the workforce, retain them in the workforce, and really utilize that labor pool within the province itself. We are also focusing on education, training, and apprenticeship. The government of Saskatchewan has invested hundreds of millions of dollars into the education, both primary and post-secondary, as well as training programs, and our apprenticeship seats have reached an all-time high to about 4,450 for the upcoming year. So addressing that need for skills and labor in the province to help match up the growth that we're experiencing with the people that we need. And finally, pre-employment and work experience training and those programs for employers, which the Saskatchewan Job Grant really does meet a couple of these, making that tie between training and skills and employment, and making sure employers are getting what they need to expand and grow their businesses for now, as well as into the future. So that's kind of the first key component of the Saskatchewan labor market strategy. Additionally, the second component, the second pillar, is about recognizing those skills in Saskatchewan. Now, this is also a service that we provide through the Ministry of Immigration and Career Training, and it's about labor mobility and allowing people who have maybe been trained elsewhere outside of Saskatchewan, whether that's across Canada or internationally, to have their credentials recognized and move and work in Saskatchewan with the skills that they've been trained for. To support that, we have the Saskatchewan Credential Recognition Service, which is a newly branded service which helps individuals who are maybe trained elsewhere to have their credentials recognized and move into the workforce more quickly. So that's kind of the key second component of the labor market strategy. And then finally, focus on international recruitment. So the first two pillars really are around helping Saskatchewan people get the first opportunity and every opportunity to engage in the workforce. The third pillar, once we've sort of exhausted our domestic labor supply, is looking externally, both across Canada and internationally, to recruit those skills that we need. We've had domestic recruitment missions to Edmonton, Calgary, Vancouver, Toronto, and we've also focused international recruitment missions to the United Arab Emirates, Poland, the Philippines, India, as well as the United Kingdom to try and attract more talent. These have been done and planned and resourced in conjunction with employers in identifying their needs, bringing employers along, and having them meet the actual candidates that they're seeking. So there's been a focus on healthcare for a number of missions. There's been a focus on trades and apprenticeship in some missions. So we're really targeting that connection between what the employers are looking for, what they need to expand and grow their business now and into the future. So that really forms the basis of the Saskatchewan labor market strategy. When we talk about the labor market strategy, there are also a number of priority sectors that we do want to focus on as we go in the next number of years. I'd mentioned healthcare with some of the international recruitment. We need skills and we need people in the healthcare sector to maintain the healthcare system in Saskatchewan. Additionally, when we talk about growth and resource development and the GDP rising and private investment, we want to focus on things like construction and skilled trades, natural resources, mining and mineral extraction, in addition to manufacturing, agriculture and ag tech, and the transportation and logistics, which I'd referenced back with our exports. All of these are areas of growth and sectors of growth for our province that we need to utilize. And in order to do that, we need to make sure people have those skill sets in the current labor market and into the future labor market. So particular attention, especially with the Saskatchewan Job Grant program, on a number of these sectors, while we're also supporting all the other sectors where we're seeing employer needs.
Yeah. One question in the box. Could you please elaborate more about international credential recognition? Do you support with the payments for the equivalents or how it works?
Absolutely. So with the credential recognition service, there's a liaison service that will help address any needs a client may have with credential recognition. In addition to that, there is a funding module for it's called the Credential Recognition Grant. So if you contact the Credential Recognition Service, you may be eligible for the Credential Recognition Grant. It's largely focused on healthcare. But that group, I'm not the expert on that group, would be able to help you kind of ongoing for kind of funding options and different opportunities working with professional associations to get those individuals their credentials recognized more quickly. Great question. Okay, so now that we set the context with the Saskatchewan labor market strategy, we're going to dive into what I'm expecting everybody is here for, is the Saskatchewan Job Grant. So at a very high level, Saskatchewan Job Grant provides businesses and nonprofit organizations up to $10,000 per trainee per fiscal year to train their new or existing employees for available jobs. Now it's really drawing that connection between the skills an employer needs and how they can either get people with those skills, upskill them, reskill them, or get them the training they need in order to be successful in those jobs. The job grant also offers up to $100,000 per fiscal year per business or nonprofit organization. So it gives you a lot of flexibility. You can train 100 people at $1,000 a piece. You can train 10 people at $10,000 a piece through the Saskatchewan Job Grant, and anything in between. So you have a lot of opportunity and flexibility in the Saskatchewan Job Grant if you apply to train the workforce that you need and the skills that are available. So what I will do is walk through some criteria around employer eligibility. We'll also talk about trainee eligibility, as well as what kind of trainings might be eligible for funding, and then a few steps in the process on what you can expect as you sort of go through the program as well. So essentially, the Saskatchewan Job Grant is an employer-driven program, and there's really three criteria about this. Employers get to decide what training is required. So nobody knows that business better than the employer, and they're able to see the skills gap, misalignment of skills potentially in the job posting that they're seeing, and they're able to identify what training they want to see in order to get them the skills that they need. The employer also gets to select the candidates who receive the training, whether they're new hires or current employees, to make sure that those trainees are meeting the expectations and standards of the employer and ensuring, like the employer has that flexibility. And then finally, the employer also gets to choose the third party that will deliver that training. So it can be a post-secondary institution, but it is not restricted solely to post-secondaries. There are private training providers that account for about 80% of our uptake. So there's a lot of different options in sort of this global learning environment that you have if you are participating in the Saskatchewan Job Grant to deliver the trainings that you're looking for and that you need as well. So I guess the key component is this is flexible.
There's a question in the chat box. It says, is the professional recognition grant for individual applicants, or is it given to organizations that provide services to clients with foreign credentials?
Credential recognition grant is specifically tailored to individuals. So again, not the expert on this, but if you do reach out to a credential recognition service, they should be able to answer a few more questions on the grant, who it applies to, how to apply for it, and how it sort of factors in as well. So, all right, thank you, Amanda. So program objectives from the Saskatchewan Job Grant. So there's 4 of them. It's intended to support investment in training. Now, training, skills development, learning and development is often cited as a barrier, especially in the financial aspect for employers. So the Saskatchewan Job Grant is really looking to mitigate one of those barriers to training and skills development. We also want to support employer access to skilled labor. Again, if employers aren't necessarily seeing the candidates that they need and they need upskilling, or there's skills gaps in their organization, we want to be able to support those employers in closing those gaps and getting the skilled labor that they need. We also want to assist individuals in gaining the skills needed for Saskatchewan jobs. Now, one of the criteria is in the job grant, we want to make sure that the Saskatchewan employer is registered and operating in Saskatchewan. We want to make sure the job is in Saskatchewan. So again, if we want to participate in that growth in the province, we want to make sure that we're supporting those jobs in Saskatchewan. And then finally, one of the most important components is connecting that training to the employment outcomes. So this is largely employer driven, I had mentioned before. We want to make sure that the employer is getting the skills that they need, and we're getting that training for jobs. So that's kind of the 4 components and the program objectives for the Saskatchewan Job Grant. A couple extra parameters as we sort of go through the criteria. As I'd mentioned before, the participating employers must have a job available for the trainee upon completion of the training. Now, we'll talk a little bit about new hires, current employees, and what that sort of looks like, but it has to be tied to employment. There has to be a job involved. Training needs to focus on new investments, not necessarily replacing funding that the employers are already providing for training. So things like onboarding, for instance. The intention of the Saskatchewan Job Grant is not necessarily to replace funding for an existing training internally. And with that, the training must also be provided by a third party. So we're not looking for employers to sort of self-fund their own training. It's got to be a third-party provider, and it can't replace existing training already with an employer. So a couple different parameters, again, making that connection between the training provider, making the connection with the employer demand, and getting those people the skills that they need. When we look at funding requirements, it's a great program in that it significantly decreases the financial burden for learning and development and training for employers. So essentially what it is, you know, you have a $30,000 program that you're looking for, you have a few different candidates going through the training. Employers are required to contribute 1/3 the overall cost, with the Saskatchewan Job Grant contributing 2/3 up to that maximum of $10,000 per trainee, $100,000 per organization. So it's a significant funding amount in this grant that helps to remove that significant financial barrier. So employers pay 1/3, we take on 2/3. And if you're a small employer, there's an added incentive on that as well, which I'll get to kind of later in the program as well. So it all sounds good. Funding sounds fantastic. Say you have a skills gap, say you're looking for people with different skills. Which employers are eligible for the Saskatchewan Job Grant? Now, there's some fairly simple criteria. You have to be a private or nonprofit employer operating in Saskatchewan, like I mentioned, in order to take advantage of that kind of Saskatchewan growth. There's also an exception around federal, provincial crowns or Indigenous governments in smaller locations or remote communities where talent and skills might be a little bit more difficult to find. So fairly simple employer eligibility. The ones that are not eligible are really around those publicly funded areas. So health authorities in different health regions, public or post-secondary institutions. We talk about urban, rural, and northern municipalities, public libraries, urban and regional parks, boards of education. And the reason that these employers are not eligible is because they're already receiving funding through the government of Saskatchewan. So we don't want to essentially double dip on funding for these particular employees. So really targeted at those private interests, those not-for-profit employers that are really looking for funding rather than kind of the publicly funded organizations that you see below. So say you check the box for the employer eligibility and you're thinking about, you know, what trainees would I potentially apply for in order to get them training? Essentially, again, some fairly simple criteria. They have to be Canadian citizens or permanent residents in order to be eligible for the Saskatchewan Job Grant. They need to be either new or existing employees. Now, there's some criteria around that, and the employers must provide an upfront intention to hire those individuals if they are a new hire. So there's some immediacy to that need as well. So when you're looking at trainees, they have to meet those number of criteria. You have a lot of flexibility as far as trainees and who you get to choose to train. One of the groups that's not eligible are temporary foreign workers, unless there is an authorization for emergency travel. For instance, the Canada-Ukraine authorization for emergency travel, some of those are eligible, but that is also subject to change. So that is the one exception in the non-eligible group that you might want to consider or look at that's currently in place. So we talk about kind of new hires, current hires, skills gaps. And when we're talking about trainees, there's sort of three categories that we really want to address with the Saskatchewan Job Grant. The first is being a new hire to the organization. So that is sort of defined as one that's not yet employed by the employer when the training is scheduled to occur and it's prior to employment. But the employer has to intend on hiring them. There has to be a minimum of 600 hours post-training of work that's upcoming. Can also apply to one who has been employed with the organization for 6 months or less, 12 months or less from the Saskatchewan Job Grant application. So when we're talking about new hires, again, if you're seeing a skills gap, somebody you want to hire, or maybe somebody you just did hire, there's an option through the Saskatchewan Job Grant for this funding. Again, I'll just reference onboarding for new employees is not necessarily eligible. The intention is more about that credential piece rather than onboarding. The second large category needs to result in a new or a better job for the trainee, and this is for existing employees in the organization. Now, what does a new and better job mean? It could mean an increase in pay. It could also mean an increase in hours, or it can increase or a promotional or an advancement opportunity to another position. So these are all eligible for an existing employee. The change for the employee must either occur within 6 months of the end of training, so it has to be a little bit more immediate, or have occurred 6 months or less from the date of the Saskatchewan Job Grant application. So again, it's not meant for succession planning. It's really meant for that immediate need. There might be an organizational change, which we'll get into in a little bit, but it has to result in a promotional opportunity. So this offers a funding opportunity when there is an immediate need to kind of move people forward and move people into a better job going forward. And then the third big example is a skills gap for an existing employee. So this is a little bit more complex, but it's got to be based on an employer-driven change in the workplace. So when you're applying for skills gap funding application, you need to be able to identify the employer-driven change and the impacts it's going to have on the level of the employee. We also want to identify the employee's functions and how they're going to change. Now, this has got to be largely driven by the employer change, not necessarily a promotional opportunity. The example I would use is, say you have an organization and you have somebody who's leading accounting, has been there for a long time, and that individual is about to retire. Say you want to, and one of your admin staff, support staff, to start taking on those accounting abilities, they're going to require some training because there's a skills gap there. So that's one example where, you know, it's a workplace change. You're expecting kind of that skills gap, so you're able to kind of apply for the Saskatchewan Job Grant. Another example would be in manufacturing. So have a couple people maybe on an assembly line and you're going to full automation. Say it's a manufacturing organization. Those individuals will have a skills gap because maybe they're not trained in automation and there's a gap there. So if you want to apply for that skills gap training, then they might be able to be trained in automation and continue on. So a couple just kind of nuanced examples to wrap your head around what does a skills gap mean and what are some of the instances that you could maybe utilize to apply for the Saskatchewan Job Grant as well. So training is flexible. That's what we're really trying to highlight most for employers, especially who are applying. The training can be anywhere from 24 training hours all the way up to 52 weeks in training, and there's no restriction on part-time training, full-time learning, etc. You also have the flexibility to engage with a training provider, a third-party training provider online, classroom, or even on your job site, or a mix of all three. So you have that flexibility to get the training where you need, when you need it, and it depends on, depending on the length, it can be between those 24 hours and 52 weeks. It does need to result in some type of credential. Now, an example would be a record of completion or a certificate or an industry recognized credential. So there has to be something at the end of the training that the trainees do receive to, you know, sort of validate the training. Things that aren't necessarily eligible are those trainings for maintaining professional designations. Also, apprenticeship training isn't eligible under the Saskatchewan Job Grant, and it's for those reasons I've mentioned before. We provide funding through the government of Saskatchewan to the Saskatchewan Apprenticeship and Trade Certification Commission, so we don't want to be kind of viewed as sort of double dipping or self-funding on programs that we already fund. Question?
How do you prove an employer-driven change? For example, I would like to learn how to do financial statements and I don't know how to do this. Parentheses skills gap. Currently auditors do it, which under legislation they should not be. How is this employer-driven when I believe I need to learn it?
That's a great question.
Yes, good question. So things that a trainee may deem as like important or necessary, or an employer might even deem as important or necessary for an employee to learn, doesn't necessarily on its own meet job grant eligibility. It still has to be from an employer-driven change. So what has changed in the workplace within a 6-month period, or will be changing in the workplace, that impacts the current skill level of that trainee that would require them to take the training. So there may not be an employer-driven change for every situation. So that's what we're looking for as part of our assessment, is we are going to look for that employer-driven change and how it impacts the selected trainee and impacts their current skill level.
Another question, I want to apply to become a CPA. However, the program is more than a year and a half. In that case, could I apply to this grant?
Great question. So the Saskatchewan Job Grant does focus on short-term training to address those immediate business needs. So any training that is longer than 52 weeks would not be eligible for job grant funding. However, in what we would consider sort of multi-year courses, so programs or courses that take more than a year, so perhaps a year and a half or 3 years or 4 years to complete. If our criteria does remain the same, then an employer could be eligible to apply when the trainee is in their last and final year of courses and when the credential will be awarded. So for example, if you're doing a 3-year program, and you're currently, just starting year 1, that would not be eligible. However, when you're in your 3rd and final year of courses, that may be eligible for job grant funding. All of the other criteria would still need to be met as well.
Thank you, Amanda, for those great examples. So as we sort of go down, so we talked about, employer eligibility, we talked about trainee eligibility, we talked about flexibility. So now we're getting into some of the costs and a little bit of more of the operational pieces of the Saskatchewan Job Grant process. So talk about training costs. The things that are eligible for costs under the Saskatchewan Job Grant are the tuition charges, things like mandatory student fees, textbooks and software, examination fees, GST, PST, all kind of those critical components to the course. The things that aren't necessarily eligible for the job grant are things like transportation, meals, accommodations, and housing. We talk about capital costs and course coordinations, different training costs incurred prior to an approved Saskatchewan Job Grant application. So just to give you an idea of kind of, okay, well, I'm applying and I'm looking at these number of costs, what percentage might be covered, what things might not be, just to give you a kind of a quick and concise idea of what that might look like.
I'm just gonna pause, sorry, there was one question. Somebody asked if a computer would be eligible for training costs. So the eligible training costs are what are required by the training provider in order to complete that course. So things like capital costs, like if you need a computer or any other type of material, if that's not actually required from the training provider and built into their quote, then it would not be eligible. Just like if there was a textbook that's optional, but not actually required by the training provider to complete that course or to successfully complete that course, those would not be eligible for funding.
There's another question in the box. Would the CPA be considered a professional designation and thus not eligible? Thank you.
So the CPA courses can be eligible if it is your first time going through the program. So if you currently already are CPA designated and you need to do certain training to maintain that designation, that would not be eligible. But if it's your first time going through the CPA courses to receive your designation, it could be eligible.
All right. Thank you, Amanda, for handling some of those questions. So a couple more sort of notes on the provincial guidelines from the program perspective that we just want to address. The employer, and I mentioned this earlier, but must be registered or operating in Saskatchewan. Again, after all, the Saskatchewan Job Grant, so the tie to the province is very, very important. Employers also need to provide confirmation if it's a new hire of a job for training or that an individual is going to be continuing in their work. So that tie to employment is really integral to the program and the application process. Employers are encouraged to use in-province training providers if possible, but again, we live in a global learning environment. So if there are training providers, across Canada, across the globe, those can be eligible as well. While we do want to encourage Saskatchewan usage, you do have a lot of different options because of that flexibility component. A couple little nuances as well as far as Saskatchewan. The employers in border communities, places like Lloydminster, they are eligible for the Saskatchewan Job Grant in case there are any of our organizations attending to date that are interested in that are located in border communities. Trainee does not have to necessarily be a resident of Saskatchewan, but the job does need to be located in Saskatchewan. So similar to the criteria of the employer operating in the province, we want to make sure that the job is also in that province in order to be eligible. And then individual employers are subject to a cap of $100,000 overall per year. So again, that's that funding cap for the employer, $100,000, and then the trainees is $10,000 as well. So I had mentioned earlier that the funding model is about a third for employers and then 2/3 for the Saskatchewan Job Grant if you are approved. We also have an added incentive for small businesses, which include 50 employees or less. So say in this example, you have about $9,000 in training costs from tuition, books, examination fees. The employer contribution would be about $3,000 for larger and medium-sized employers. But if you have 50 employees or less, you could either contribute $3,000 in eligible training costs, and we pay the other 2/3, but you can also contribute in wages as well, which essentially gives you 5/6 of support from the Saskatchewan Job Grant rather than just the 2/3 of support. So that does allow you to contribute wages to employees as they're training, and it does better support those small businesses in helping them grow. So a little bit more flexibility for small businesses, a little bit more support, a little bit more encouragement on growing those small businesses in Saskatchewan and helping to make them successful through training. Just as a little bit of a testimonial, this is one of our regular users of the Job Grant program. This is Creative Options Regina, which is a nonprofit organization that regularly uses Job Grant and is very pleased with sort of the level of service that they receive from our consultants and the level of funding and the ability they have now to train the people that require those skills that they're looking for and allowing them to expand their business. So, there's a lot of different success stories with different organizations, employers, nonprofits. But this is just one in particular that we can sort of look to and that has been a longstanding partner with the Saskatchewan Job Grant program. So having said all that, we talked about employers, we talked about eligible trainees and different training costs and training providers and a variety of different things. So say you check all the boxes for all those criteria and you're interested in kind of the next steps, what does that look like? So we encourage you to visit the Job Grant website, which the next slide I'll have the website and our contact information, and it provides program details for you to review. It also provides a very extensive Saskatchewan Job Grant applicant guide that will sort of walk you through the process of what might be required, what kind of documents you can be expected to submit, and sort of a step-by-step process on if you're interested in the Job Grant program, how do you kind of pull your application together and be more successful with it. After you've reviewed the website, the Saskatchewan Job Grant applicant guide, you're more than welcome to find an application form, which is on our website as well. Fill that out and submit it to our Saskatchewan Job Grant office. Now, we have two. There's one in Saskatoon. There's also one in Regina. So we have a kind of a shared mailbox, and it'll be distributed to the closest location. And then you will also be contacted for a review of that application for completion, any missing information, clarifications that we might need. If you are successful and if you are approved, you'll be notified. We will provide a contract, and then we'll start proceeding through kind of the training and the next steps. So if you are interested, we encourage you to check out the applicant guide, fill out an application form, submit it to our offices, and then we'll work through it as we review your application as well. After the application, say, has been successful, the training is completed, and you're looking for sort of the next steps after, what happens after training is completed, reimbursement is provided upon completion of that training. So employers are responsible for all upfront costs. And then when that final reporting comes through that, yes, they've met the criteria, yes, the trainee has completed all their credentials, then we'll get some cost reporting and we'll be able to reimburse that 2/3 or potentially 5/6 if it's wages with a small employer. Employer and trainee outcome reporting is required and will follow the training. And then in addition, we're always looking to improve. We always want to get feedback. So employers and trainees may be contacted by survey after the fact to either provide feedback, feedback on our client service, feedback on our process or our program or anything like that. So as you sort of progress through this job grant application and process, we'll be looking to kind of keep you involved and get some feedback at the tail end. So that concludes, I guess, the largest portion of the subject matter on the Saskatchewan Job Grant. We're open for questions. We have some time, I think. So contact info, we'll leave this up on the screen. There's a website, saskatchewan.ca/job-grant, as well as our email address. Again, it's the Saskatchewan Job Grant. We are going through rebranding. So this is our current email address if you want to submit your application or have extensive questions. So cansaskjobgrant@gov.sk.ca. So with that, maybe Michaela, I think you have a couple words, and then we'll maybe dive into some questions.